Just going to lag for half a moment and let some folks log on. Good to be back with you once again. I'm Jim LaPierre. This is SoberNow.com, and today's topic is gaining emotional maturity through the course of our recovery. This is something I don't get to hear talked about an awful lot, but I think it's a reality in which any recovery process, whether that's from substance use disorder, trauma, mental illness, is in a very real sense a process of growing up. And the problem with growing up is that it remains optional. Sadly, an awful lot of us never do it. That doesn't mean that you have to become a grown-up. We are free to retain all the best aspects of being childlike and transcend all the aspects of being childish. Very much welcome your questions and your comments. Would love to make this more interactive as we go. If you're watching the video long after it's done, please drop me a quick message to let me know your thoughts. Always want to hear from you as far as topics you'd like covered and questions you'd like answered. We're streaming today on ChooseHelp.com, streaming on SoberNow's Facebook page. If you haven't already been over there, please just give it a quick like. You'll get notifications for every live stream and for other cool things that we're doing. Okay, so let's get into it. We know, and I think we have a strong awareness of the ways in which substance use disorder arrests development. It's very common, especially in addiction treatment and in 12-step fellowships, that there's an agreed upon idea that the age at which we start using drugs or alcohol to cope with emotions is the point at which we stop. Our development is very much arrested. My experience is the same is true of surviving traumatic events, experiencing ongoing abuse or neglect. Any type of especially overwhelming experience tends to inhibit further growth. It tends to develop insecurities, and progressively we learn, especially as adult children of alcoholics, as children of addicts, we learn to hide our true self. And of course, whatever we hide, we arrest the development of, and find it difficult to ask for what we need and to admit what our struggles are. I commonly hear from especially people in their 20s and early 30s that they have a hard time with adulting. Accountability and responsibility, of course, are two of the big keys to recovery, and they are front and center in terms of overcoming self-centeredness, reactivity, impulsivity, a lot of the things that we might associate with being childish. My experience, particularly with working with people in active addiction, is that a lot of us can be very outwardly responsible. I've worked with highly educated, very successful professional people who manage large companies, have status, they're working as a doctor, a lawyer, they're doing what we might see as important work, and on paper, they're the quote-unquote people that have it all together. They're the people that appear very successful, at least at face value, but when I really get to know them, folks, when they're first coming into recovery from substance use disorder, very commonly there's this part of them that's well hidden. It's what a therapist might refer to as the inner child, and it's a lot of unhealthy tendencies that are really the product of unmet needs, inadequate amounts of support, and oftentimes an external locus of control as opposed to an internal locus. Those are terms only a therapist would use. What they refer to is being motivated by things that are intrinsic, based on our identity, beliefs, and values, as opposed to things that are external. The expectations of authority figures, being how and who others want us to be. So ideally, through the course of any recovery process, we're developing a stronger sense of identity, of who we are, of what we value, and progressively our actions emulate or are based on those underlying beliefs and values. I often will ask people when I start working with them in treatment, how old do you feel? And it's interesting the different answers that I get to that question. Because, first of all, there's an axiom where the more fucked up somebody sees themselves as being, the more likely they are to tell me their chronological age. And they'll say, this is ridiculous. By 45, I should have it together. I should know what I'm doing. By whatever age they are, or however long they've been clean and sober. We all have this image in our mind of where we're supposed to be or what it is that we're supposed to be able to do. But if we get really honest, we'll admit things like there's this part of me that feels like a scared little kid. There's this part of me that knows that I'm a fraud, that I'm just pretending that I know what I'm doing. And so one of the greatest honors for me in coaching and as a therapist is when folks have the courage to ask things that they've been afraid to ask, or look for skills and things that they equate with being more responsible, being more independent, or being able to be more mature in all of their affairs. And so this is a tall order. We oftentimes make an invalid comparison, of course. When we come from a place of feeling less than, we compare our insides to other people's outsides, and we decide that they must know what they're doing and they look like they have it all together. And so, sadly, we never make that comparison and feel better about ourselves. We make comparisons that most often result in staying stuck. And so these, of course, are obstacles to asking for help and seeking what it is that we need. We have a tendency to cover up our fears, our insecurities, our inadequacies. Maybe we overcompensate for them. Maybe we just avoid them altogether. But looking at our struggles and sharing them takes away a lot of the power that they have. Just being able to express our fears and talk about what it is that we find so challenging reduces fear. The more that we expose these things, the less power they hold over us. And so being able to consciously seek what it is that we're looking for, especially in terms of role models, chosen family, people that we want to be like. Old school AA folks would always tell me that the choice of a sponsor should be based on meeting somebody who has what you want, whether that's long-term sobriety, maybe some serenity that we see in a person, a lot of spiritual growth we see. But when it comes to choosing someone who might help you to have a stronger sense of identity or a stronger sense of who you are as a person, those choices tend to be subconsciously made, and they're often projected onto sponsors. I remind folks all the time that when they choose a sponsor, they're choosing someone to help them work through the steps and whatever it is that a sponsor and sponsee agree upon. But quite often what we're doing is choosing a mother figure or a father figure. And I remind folks that they didn't sign up for that. So the more clear we are, whether it's with a sponsor, a therapist, a coach, or whoever it is that's supporting us, the more clear we are about our expectations both ways, what they expect from us and what we expect from them, the more successful those relationships and those investments tend to be. I ask folks to be brutally, or as the big book says, rigorously honest with themselves, because there's really only two ways that we seek the things that we most need, consciously and subconsciously. So when people tell me that they're trying to find the answers, or trying to figure it out, or they're trying to find themselves, what I know is they have a vague sense that something's missing and that they need support, but they don't necessarily know what it is that they're seeking. All right, I'm going to pause just for a moment and check some of the feeds that we have going today. Again, very much welcome your questions. Would love to hear your comments on this topic. What's your experience been? They didn't sign up. Whoops. Let's try. Erica, thank you for writing in. Being a place to talk about and acknowledge fear seems to be a big reason AA works for a lot of people, at least for the initial start. I agree wholeheartedly. I also know that fear is probably one of the hardest things for us to talk about. It requires an enormous amount of vulnerability. And when we're talking about the fear of using or fear of relapse, I think that is typically very well received. Some fears are a lot harder for us to talk about, particularly when we recognize that they're irrational fears or they're things that are based in our past. And bringing those to light in the present can be extraordinarily uncomfortable. The example I most often use is the fear of the dark, because developmentally it's normal. Every child at some point developmentally has a fear of the dark. And those who grew up in healthy and well-adjusted families were not just told to get over it. They weren't just told some rational explanation like, hey, there's nothing there in the dark that isn't there in the light. The child who grows up in a healthy family is held and nurtured and made to feel safe. And so they have a lifetime advantage over the rest of us because they have a visceral sense of what it feels like to be protected and what safety is. For a lot of us, unfortunately, we grew up in families where that wasn't provided. And so to feel safe is something that is kind of foreign to us. And that's problematic in a lot of ways, because we are people who tend to maintain status quo without even realizing it. We gravitate towards the familiar. We sometimes accept predictability as a poor substitute for security, and we just find it easier to sit on the fence and kind of be ambivalent than to pursue change. I think one of the hardest aspects of recovery is that we constantly have to go one more step outside of our comfort zone. And so there's fears that folks are comfortable discussing, like maybe the fear of failure, but then there's fears that people tend to avoid talking about. The fear of success is one of the most difficult ones that I hear. Anytime that we feel like we just don't know how to be, it's uncomfortable, and sometimes we revert to self-sabotage because it's much easier to get back to what's familiar than it is to continue to heal and grow. The simple truth is, getting better is scary. I heard this adage years ago that an addict will jump out of a third-story window because they're afraid of falling out of the penthouse. Self-destruction is something that, it's not like we ever forget how to do that. And when we get scared enough, it's the easiest way to get back inside of our comfort zone. Thank you for writing in. My fear isn't of using anymore. My fear is the reason I began using in the first place. My fear is being a permanent prisoner of my ego, always in the end never feeling like I'm enough. Thank you so much for sharing that. I greatly appreciate that. I think in recovery, the two most common fears and the two most common forms of insecurity that little kid that we're protecting or separating ourselves from has two fears. One, that we're not enough, and interestingly, a secondary fear that we are too much. So when I talk with folks about their social anxiety, when I talk to them about sharing in meetings or letting people just get closer to them, there's a fear that maybe I'll overwhelm the people who are trying to support me. Maybe I'm too needy. And I joke with my clients and say, look, I'm probably the neediest guy you know. I need help on my good days. I need people that I haven't even met yet, but people that I trust that my higher power will put in my life to give me the learning experiences that I need to have, the support that I need. I think most of us are far more comfortable giving support than we are receiving it. There's so much more vulnerability involved in receiving. So I'm happy for you that you got to a place where you're not afraid of relapse. A lot of us do have that urge to use or urge to drink removed, which is beautiful. But the reason that you began using in the first place, thank you for touching on that. For so many of us, the reason we started using in the first place was as soon as we get sober, memories surface. For too many of us, we started using to cover up past abuse, past neglect, to not feel. For too many of us, feeling numb felt like a desirable alternative to what we do feel. So as my friends in AA say, the good thing about being sober is you feel more, and the bad thing about being sober is you feel more. Learning how to identify and cope with a wide range of, and everything else is, I'm okay. And then at some point, maybe in treatment, somebody shows you a list of different emotions that people experience, and there's over 100 of them, and you're like, holy shit. When you grow up the way I did, you learn to ignore most of what you feel, and you become progressively externally focused, and you're intuitive, so you know what other people feel, you know what other people want and need, but you tend not to have anywhere near that type of awareness of self. And so we just kind of do what we do, and maybe it's a low-level depression. I joke with my clients sometimes that when we become complacent or don't continuously seek further growth, life becomes kind of a Dave Matthews song. Everything's vaguely melancholy, and it's okay, but it's not really okay. I love Dave Matthews, always have been a fan of his music, but I find that if I listen to more than 3 or 4 of his songs in a row, I kind of want to kill myself. So Dave's music is pretty transparent. There's a live set that he did, I heard years ago, where he talks about, he introduces the song by saying this is probably a call for help, and a lot of his music is about a very disappointing relationship between himself and his father, which is a huge piece about emotional maturity. Most of what we learn about how to have self-control, how to express ourselves, how to communicate, how to have relationships, all of this is born out of our family of origin and the lessons that we learned growing up that we weren't even aware we were learning. One of the biggest difficulties for me was that I grew up with a father who I very much did not want to be like, and so without realizing it, by default, so much of the person I am was modeled after my mother, because I saw her as a giving, loving person. And what I didn't see was the extraordinary codependency, the selflessness, which is unfortunately the opposite of being selfish. Neither extreme is healthy. And so those became obstacles to my emotional maturity, and specifically in my ability to relate to others in a healthy way. I was just a one-way street. I could do for other people, I wouldn't allow them to do for me. I was very comfortable with their vulnerability, and I was not at all comfortable with my own. This is one of the many ways in which what I do for a living has been really healthy for me, because I hate being a hypocrite. So whatever I suggest to folks that they should be doing, I have to do that too. I think moving away from self-centeredness is probably one of the most important lessons, and what I underscore that because a lot of us don't have an awareness that we're self-centered. We think of it as being the same as being selfish. It's not. To be self-centered, it's another expression that folks in recovery use. I'm the most important piece of shit in this room. My friend Artis used to introduce it as something's wrong, it must be me. Self-centeredness can be to feel like everything is your fault. Self-centeredness can feel like everything is your responsibility to fix or to make better. And of course, this is an impossibility, but we don't have a healthy perspective, so it feels like everything in the final analysis must be about me. And this is one of the things that I oftentimes say to people in recovery when they're struggling with something, is to say, you know, maybe it's not about you. Maybe it has nothing whatsoever to do with you. A couple more comments. Nicole, thanks for writing in. I learned and taught myself to cope with my feelings negatively, but now trying to do it positively is very scary, very overwhelming, so much anxiety. wearing like a baby, things start from step one. Thank you for saying that. I agree wholeheartedly. Most of what we learned about self-control is based in rejection of self. It's based in being even cruel to self. And so I ask folks to notice their self-talk. We tend to seek self-control by holding resentment against self. We seek self-control by avoiding things that would require us to be vulnerable. We just are kind of beating up on ourselves all day, every day. And so I'm asking folks to look at the ways in which they cope. Obviously, when we're using drugs and alcohol to cope, that's unhealthy, but there's a million other things that we use to cope that are unhealthy. And kind of the picking the bad up and beating yourself up is arguably one of the most common. So we learn to cope in healthier ways, and ideally, progressively, we include more and more people in that process. A huge piece of emotional maturity is coming to a place where we can have healthy friendships. And this is a huge stumbling block for most of us because in retrospect we see that we haven't had really healthy friendships. We had people that we did drugs with. We've had people that we only enjoyed their company if we were drinking together. And so learning how to be a good friend is a huge part of emotional maturity, but first of all, most of us don't want to admit that we're lacking friends, and we don't often admit that we're not really sure how to do that. Again, I always think of Bruce Springsteen. He said, you end up like a dog that's been beat too much till you spend half your life just covering up. So what we cover up are scars of past trauma, mental illness, all of the destructive things that we do to ourselves, and then again, by virtue of hiding them, we make it impossible to overcome them. Erica, thanks for writing in again. Definitely guilty of being selfless to the point of it likely being avoidance versus actual being kindness that does others good. I have a very similar, very loving, but very passive and avoidant family of origin dynamic, which I'd like to not repeat with my own children. Kudos to you. That's huge. Breaking intergenerational patterns is no small undertaking. It's something that you deserve to have a ton of support with. Being selfless is absolutely being avoidant of self. It's common, especially those of us who are caregivers or rescuers. We put all of our time and energy externally so that there's nothing left to look internally. It's an exhausting lifestyle in which we're constantly doing. There's an adage about being a human doer as opposed to being a human being. A lot of us don't know how to just be. Can you spend even 5 minutes just being present with yourself, just sitting and just having a greater awareness of your own needs, your own wants and feelings, and ideally asking for those to be met. But to be selfless is to lack a sense of identity. We have a strong sense of who we are to others, but not to ourselves. We may have a sense of being our own worst enemy. We may have a sense of just being ashamed or feeling guilty about everything. So my hope is that gradually we connect with each other and greater possibilities are born. This is no small undertaking, but it is something that is commonly occurring in fellowships of every kind, particularly in 12-step communities, but it also happens in places that might seem unlikely to you. Places like group therapy is where I found my tribe. Having a willingness to share my struggles makes them about 1,000,000 times easier to overcome. The place that I'm in today, I've learned to expose my fears because my problems today are good problems. But what I've learned is when I don't expose my fears and anxieties about the next undertaking, the next bit of growth that I'm going to have, then I will often disappoint myself. So by exposing those fears, I gain encouragement and support and a lot of beautiful things, but I also gain a ton of accountability. And having that in place ensures that I'm going to follow through. I'm not going to break that commitment to myself. Alright, just going to do one more quick check on the feeds. It's been wonderful hearing from so many of you today. Stacy, thank you for writing in. I appreciate your kind words. It's always good to connect with each and every one of you, and I want to invite you to connect with me further. Jim@sobernow.com is the easiest way to do that. Also, please check out Sober Now's YouTube channel. There's about 120 odd videos there now on various aspects of recovery from substance use disorder, from trauma, and from mental illness. Check that out, and also check out our site. SoberNow.com is now a super low price subscription service. It's more affordable than it's ever been, less than $15 a month. Gets you access to our 28-day home study program for those who are early on in substance use disorder recovery or those who want to fortify their recovery. Complete anonymity, complete confidentiality, and we also have a separate 28-day program for affected others, for those of us who have loved ones in active addiction. Coping and ensuring our own well-being and making sure that we're not putting our whole life on hold while we're afraid for our loved ones. I want to just touch on this real quick because, Chris, I think you were asking about the fear of being held prisoner by your own ego. My experience is that being a prisoner of my ego is fear. Sometimes we call it pride, but I don't think of it as any healthy form of being proud of something. I think of it as getting in my own way. I think of it as avoiding vulnerability. I always encourage folks to check out Brene Brown's TED Talks. She has one on shame and one on vulnerability. And they really hold some simple keys to how we allow ourselves to open up. And when we do that with kindred spirits, it's so beautiful what becomes possible. The people that have most supported me are people that have been through their own hell and remain a work in progress and continue to grow and to heal. But that is an ongoing undertaking. So I hope that, especially as we continue through the pandemic and the challenges that each of us face, that you're taking good care of yourselves, that you're doing the basics, maybe a little bit of improvement in your hydration, nutrition, exercise, and sleep. I hope that you'll reach out to me. I'd love to answer any questions that you have about your recovery or just be a resource to you in general. That's it for this week. I'll be back next Thursday at noon Eastern and look forward to talking to you then.